the eastern wall of Fenwick Ranch wasn't collapsing. It was moving. Each time the blizzard slammed into the horse barn, the old beams groaned deeper, and the roof sank a little farther toward the frightened horses below. Outside, one man was still fighting the storm alone. Inside, a little girl stared at the guide rope, disappearing into the white darkness, and whispered, "Is Papa coming back?" No one answered. Because if that rope came back empty, the barn would fall and everyone inside would be buried before sunrise. The strange part? Just 7 weeks earlier, that same man had arrived with nothing but 2 starving children, and a promise no one in their right mind would have believed. He looked a widow in the eyes and said, "Give my kids milk, and I'll fix your ranch." How did a starving stranger become the only reason an entire ranch survived the worst blizzard of the century? By the second night of the Red Elk blizzard, the eastern wall of Fenwick Ranch had begun to move. Not collapse, move. Each time the wind struck the horse barn, the old cottonwood beams bent inward with a deep, splintering groan. Snow forced itself through cracks no wider than a knife blade, filling the hayloft with white dust. Below, 14 horses kicked against their stalls while a newborn calf lay shivering beneath a wool blanket beside the wood stove. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 26 degrees below zero. The guide rope between the frontier cabin and the barn had disappeared beneath the drifting snow. One of the water storage barrels had split. The north gate was buried. Somewhere beyond the willow windbreak, 3 milk cows were trapped against a frozen fence line, and Micah Dorn was still outside. Adeline Fenwick stood in the barn doorway with the guide rope wrapped twice around her waist. The other end vanished into the white darkness. "Pull again," 11-year-old Owen whispered. Adeline planted both boots against the floor and pulled. The rope tightened, then went slack. For one terrible moment, nobody inside the barn moved. Millie, Micah's 6-year-old daughter, stood beside the stove, clutching a tin cup with both hands. 7 weeks earlier, that same child had arrived at Fenwick Ranch too weak to cry. Now she stared at the rope and asked the question no one wanted to answer. "Is Papa coming back?" Adeline looked toward the doorway. The wind screamed through the opening like something alive. If Micah failed to reach the outer braces, the wall would tear loose before morning. If the wall failed, the roof would follow. And if the roof fell, every animal, every sack of grain, and every person sheltering inside the barn would be buried beneath snow and timber. The entire frontier ranch now depended on a man who had arrived with nothing. No horse, no money, no food. Only 2 hungry children and a promise no sensible ranch owner should have believed. 7 weeks earlier, in October of 1889, Micah Dorn had walked into Black Willow Basin pulling a handcart with 1 broken wheel. The first frost had already silvered the prairie grass. Thin ice formed each morning along the edges of the stock ponds, and the cottonwoods had begun dropping their last yellow leaves. Every experienced homesteader knew what those signs meant. Prairie winter was coming early. Micah was 37, though hunger and grief made him look older. His coat had been repaired so many times that little of the original wool remained. 1 boot was wrapped with rawhide to hold the sole in place. A narrow scar crossed the back of his right hand, the kind left by a saw blade rather than a fight. Behind him walked Owen, thin but watchful, one hand resting on the cart whenever the wheel struck a stone. Millie sat beneath an old canvas cover with a faded quilt around her shoulders. She had stopped asking when they would eat. That frightened Micah more than her crying ever had. For 12 years he had worked as a ranch hand, wagon repairman, and carpenter along scattered frontier homesteads between Colorado and Wyoming. He knew how to reset a barn post, raise a sagging roof, seal a frontier cabin against wind, repair a hand pump, and build grain storage that kept rats away from winter wheat. But skill did not always mean security. When his wife died from fever the previous spring, Micah lost more than a partner. He lost the woman who kept accounts, preserved vegetables, traded sewing for flour, and somehow made an uncertain life feel steady. Without her, every week became a calculation. Food, work, shelter, children. He accepted jobs wherever he found them, but most ranch owners wanted a single man who could sleep in a bunkhouse and move on when the work ended. 2 children made him slower. A 6-year-old girl made employers nervous. 3 different homesteads had offered Micah work only if he sent the children elsewhere. He refused every time. By the time he reached Black Willow Basin, the family had eaten their last strip of dried venison. Owen had hidden half a corn cake inside his coat, not for himself, but for Millie. Micah noticed. He pretended he had not. Then Fenwick Ranch appeared beyond the rise. At first glance, it looked prosperous. A wide horse barn stood beside two smaller livestock sheds. A stone-lined root cellar rose behind the main cabin. Acres of dry pasture stretched toward the southern ridge, and a homestead garden lay beneath a layer of straw near the kitchen. But Micah had spent too many years around frontier farming to be fooled by distance. The ranch was surviving. It was not prepared. The main barn doors faced northwest, directly toward the strongest winter wind. Hay rested on bare earth beneath a leaking lean-to. A shallow water pipe ran above the frost line. One side of the horse barn had settled lower than the other, twisting the roof just enough for snow to collect unevenly. The old willow windbreak stood too close to the barn. Instead of protecting the structure, it would trap snow against the entrance. Fenwick Ranch had strength. It also had hidden weaknesses. Adeline Fenwick was splitting ice from a livestock trough when Micah approached the fence. She was 34 and had run the ranch alone since her husband died beneath an overturned timber wagon 3 winters earlier. She wore a heavy brown work coat, leather gloves, and no expression of helplessness. A ledger was tucked beneath one arm. A short-handled hammer rested in the other. She looked first at Micah, then at Owen, then at the canvas-covered shape in the cart. "What do you need?" she asked. Micah could have asked for work. He could have asked for shelter. He could have listed every homestead skill he had learned since boyhood. Instead, he lifted Millie from the cart. The child's face looked almost colorless beneath the quilt. "Milk," he said. "For my children." Adeline's eyes moved to the girl's dry lips. "What can you offer?" Micah looked past her toward the barn, the hay, the shallow pipe, and the crooked roofline. Then he said the words that would eventually be repeated across Black Willow Basin. "Give my kids milk. I'll fix your ranch." Adeline did not smile. "Men make large promises when they're hungry." Micah nodded toward the horse barn. "Your north sill is rotting. The roof is carrying weight on the wrong posts. Your hay is pulling moisture from the ground, and your water line will freeze before the first frontier blizzard." For the first time, Adeline's expression changed. Not trust. Attention. Micah shifted Millie higher against his shoulder. "I'm not asking you to believe me," he said. "Feed them tonight. By morning, I'll show you where winter will enter." Adeline studied him for several seconds, then she opened the gate. "The children eat first," she said. Inside the frontier cabin, she warmed fresh milk slowly beside the wood stove. Owen watched every movement of the ladle as though someone might take the pot away before it reached the table. Adeline placed a bowl before him. He ate half, then slipped the remaining bread into his pocket. She saw him do it. She said nothing. Instead, she cut another slice and placed it beside his bowl. That small act would matter more than anyone in the room understood. Because Micah had arrived hoping to fix your ranch. But before winter ended, Adeline would discover that the most damaged thing on her land was not the barn, the water line, or the failing roof. It was the belief inside 2 hungry children that tomorrow could still be trusted. And before the first snowstorm arrived, Micah would uncover a weakness beneath the horse barn that could destroy the entire frontier family. Would you have opened the gate for a stranger making such a promise, or would you have sent him back onto the trail? The next morning, Micah Dorn was already outside before the first hint of sunrise reached the eastern prairie. Frost covered every fence rail, and each breath drifted through the cold air like smoke from a dying campfire. The basin lay silent except for the muffled chewing of cattle and the distant cry of a raven circling above the cottonwoods. Most people would have looked at Fenwick Ranch and seen a sturdy frontier homestead preparing for another ordinary winter. Micah saw something entirely different. He saw dozens of small mistakes quietly working together, waiting for the first true storm to turn them into disaster. Adeline stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin mugs of coffee. She expected to find him repairing something immediately. Instead, he was standing perfectly still near the horse barn, watching the wind. "You've been standing there for 10 minutes, she called. "I've been listening," Micah answered. She frowned. "Listening to what? The wind never lies." She joined him, wrapping her coat tighter against the cold. For nearly a minute, neither of them spoke. Then another gust swept across the open prairie. Instead of flowing around the barn, the wind struck the northwest corner directly before curling underneath the raised foundation. Micah pointed with one gloved finger. "Feel that? I feel cold." "No, feel where the cold comes from." Adeline closed her eyes for a moment. The wind hit her face, then disappeared beneath the barn. "It goes underneath." Micah nodded. "Exactly." He knelt beside the foundation and pushed his hand between 2 weathered beams. "The air isn't attacking your walls. It's attacking your floor." She stared at him. "I've lived here 7 years. No one ever mentioned that. Because everyone watches the roof. Almost nobody studies the ground. He picked up a handful of dry prairie grass and tossed it beneath the barn. Instead of blowing away, the grass was pulled inward through the gap beneath the floor. Every hour, Micah said quietly, your barn steals heat from itself. Adeline suddenly understood. If the floor stays cold, the livestock stay cold. And they eat more hay, they burn more energy. They produce less milk. Micah smiled for the first time. Now you're thinking like winter. That sentence stayed with Adeline long after the conversation ended. Instead of repairing broken boards, Micah spent the rest of the morning walking slowly across the property. Owen followed several yards behind carrying a notebook Adeline had found inside the house. Every observation became a drawing instead of words. The hayloft, the water barrels, the grain shed, the chicken coop, the smoke from the frontier cabin chimney. Even the angle of the afternoon sunlight against the stone wall of the root cellar. By noon, Owen finally asked the question that had been bothering him. Papa, why aren't you fixing anything? Micah rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. Because good repairs begin long before the hammer. He drew a simple square in the dirt. If you see only broken wood, you'll repair one board. Then he drew arrows representing the wind. If you understand why the board failed, you'll protect the whole building. Owen nodded slowly, trying to remember every word. Adeline, listening from the porch, realized he wasn't only teaching his son, he was teaching her. That afternoon they inspected the hay storage. Nearly 40% of the hay rested directly on packed earth beneath a lean-to roof. Micah pulled apart one bale. The outer layer looked perfectly dry. The center was warm. Too warm. He handed the hay to Adeline. Smell it. She leaned closer. A faint sour odor drifted upward. It's damp. It started drying too late. I've fed this to the cattle before. You've been lucky. He broke the bale apart completely. When moisture stays trapped inside hay, heat builds slowly. Most winters nothing happens. And the others? It catches fire. Adeline looked back toward the barn instinctively. You mean, I mean one lantern, one spark, or enough internal heat, and the whole loft burns. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. She had spent years believing the greatest danger came from blizzards. Micah had found 3 threats before lunch. None involved snow. Late that afternoon, they reached the north pasture where a line of aging willow trees stood between the ranch and the open prairie. Adeline had always believed they protected the property from winter wind. Micah shook his head. They're too close. They've always been there, and they've always trapped snow against your barn. He snapped off a small willow branch and planted it upright in the soil. When the first frontier blizzard comes, the wind slows here. He placed another stick several feet behind it. The snow falls. Another stick. It piles. Another. It blocks your barn doors. Adeline stared across the open ground. So I've been creating my own snowdrift, without realizing it. She laughed softly despite herself. I hired you to fix your ranch. No, Micah corrected gently. You gave 2 hungry children a meal. I'm simply returning the favor. As evening settled across Black Willow Basin, Owen and Millie sat near the wood stove eating thick vegetable stew. This time Owen finished every bite without hiding bread inside his pocket. Adeline noticed. She said nothing. Some wounds, she realized, healed only after they no longer needed to defend themselves. Outside, Micah stood alone beneath the fading sky. Far to the northwest, a long gray cloud stretched across the horizon like smoke lying against the earth. Most people would have called it another autumn front. Micah watched the geese flying unusually low beneath it. Then he noticed the horses. Every one of them had turned their backs toward the northwest wind at exactly the same moment, he whispered to himself. Not yet, but soon. The first blizzard wasn't coming next month. It was already on its way. Before dawn on the 4th morning, Micah woke to a sound that made him sit upright before he was fully awake. It wasn't the wind. It was every horse in the barn stamping at once. The rhythm was wrong. Not restless. Afraid. He grabbed his lantern and rushed outside. Owen followed barefoot to the porch while Adeline reached the horse barn from the opposite side. Inside, 14 horses crowded against the southern wall, snorting and pulling hard against their halters. Even Ranger, the old collie who never barked without reason, stood rigid with his ears pinned forward. What frightened them? Adeline asked. Micah didn't answer immediately. He knelt and pressed his hand against the packed dirt floor. It vibrated, only slightly, but enough. He lifted the lantern and followed the movement toward the north corner of the barn. Stay back. Using an iron bar, he pried up one loose plank near a support post. Beneath it, instead of solid frozen ground, the soil had become dark and soft. A thin stream of water trickled silently beneath the foundation. Adeline stared. That wasn't here last week. No, Micah replied quietly. It was hidden. He pushed the bar deeper into the mud. It sank almost to the handle. The support isn't standing on earth anymore. Ofen swallowed. Then what's holding the barn up? Micah looked at the massive timber above them. For now, habit. A silence settled over the barn. The danger had changed. They had been preparing for snow. Instead, the ground itself was beginning to fail. Micah spent the next hour tracing the hidden water with a shovel. The underground seep led toward the old spring uphill, where decades earlier someone had laid a shallow drainage trench. Time, roots, and frost had slowly redirected the water beneath the horse barn. If winter freezes this underground, Micah explained, the expanding ice will lift part of the foundation. And if it melts again, the soil turns to mud. Adeline finished the thought herself. The barn shifts, and the roof follows. For the first time since he arrived, even Micah looked troubled. This wasn't a repair he had expected. By afternoon, word spread across Black Willow Basin that the widow had hired a stranger to save her frontier ranch. Not everyone approved. Elias Crow, whose ranch bordered the southern fence line, rode over just before sunset. He listened while Micah explained the underground water. Then he laughed. You've dug one muddy hole and now you're frightening her into rebuilding half the barn? Micah remained calm. I'm asking her to redirect the water. You've been here 4 days. I've been watching. Elias shook his head, or guessing. For a moment, even Adeline hesitated. The seep was real. But was it truly dangerous? Micah noticed the doubt in her face. Instead of arguing, he picked up a bucket. Come with me. He led both of them uphill to the old spring. There he placed handfuls of fine ash into the shallow stream before blocking it briefly with loose stones. Several minutes later, Owen shouted from the barn. The water! Everyone hurried back. Gray ash floated from beneath the foundation exactly where Micah had uncovered the seep. No one spoke. The underground connection was undeniable. Elias slowly removed his hat. I owe you an apology. Micah simply nodded. Nature doesn't care whether we believe it. Before darkness fell, the entire household began digging a temporary diversion trench away from the barn. It wouldn't solve the problem permanently, but it might buy enough time before the first true frontier blizzard arrived. As they worked, Ranger suddenly lifted his head and growled toward the northern ridge. High above the prairie, thousands of snow geese crossed the sky. Not south, straight southeast, fast. Much lower than normal. Micah stopped digging. The shovel slipped from his hands. Adeline looked at him. What is it? His eyes never left the birds. I've never seen them fly that low this early. Is that bad? Micah answered so quietly that only she heard him. No, it's worse. The storm has changed its path. The geese disappeared before sunset. Not one flock, hundreds of them. For nearly 20 minutes, long wavering lines crossed the gray sky, flying far lower than they should have. Even the oldest ranchers in Black Willow Basin stopped their wagons to watch. Micah never looked away. They're not escaping winter, he murmured. They're outrunning it. Adeline followed his gaze. The air still felt strangely calm, no snow, no bitter wind. The prairie looked almost peaceful. If the weather's changing, she asked, why is everything so quiet? Micah stooped to pick up a handful of dry prairie grass. Instead of falling back to the ground, the blades drifted slowly eastward before circling downward. The wind is climbing. I don't understand. You will tomorrow. That evening, Micah called everyone into the kitchen of the frontier cabin. The table was covered with charcoal sketches Owen had drawn during the past several days. Maps of the ranch, the horse barn, the spring, the drainage trench, the root cellar, and every fence line. Micah placed a small stone on the drawing. This is the cabin. Then another, the barn. Another, the spring. Finally, he traced a wide arc across the map. This is where the storm will push snow. Adeline frowned. Everyone around here stacks hay against the north wall before winter. And that's exactly why many lose it. He explained that when strong northwest winds struck the barn, the wall of stacked hay would trap drifting snow. As the drift hardened, moisture would slowly creep into the lower bales. Weeks later, families would discover mold, rot, or frozen feed just when livestock needed it most. So where should it go? Owen asked. Micah pointed toward slightly higher ground east of the barn. We build a raised hay platform. Adeline looked doubtful. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough time not to. No one argued again. The next morning became a race against a storm no one else believed was coming. Fence rails became temporary supports. Old wagon axles became lifting bars. Even broken lumber that had rested behind the grain shed for years found a purpose. Micah organized the work without ever raising his voice. Owen and Millie gathered flat stones. Adeline reinforced the platform posts. Together they lifted dozens of heavy hay bales onto a floor nearly 2 feet above the frozen ground. Every hour Micah paused to study the sky. Not because he expected snow, because he expected change. Around midday, Ranger began barking toward the western pasture. The cattle had stopped grazing. Instead, the entire herd crowded tightly together, their backs pressed against one another, although no wind yet touched the valley. Adeline stared. They've never done that before daylight. Micah's expression hardened. They're conserving heat before they need it. By late afternoon, another unexpected problem appeared. The temporary diversion trench they had dug beneath the horse barn wasn't carrying enough water. Instead, muddy water began seeping from a second location beneath the eastern support beams. Micah drove an iron rod into the ground. It struck nothing. Again, nothing. The earth beneath part of the barn had become almost hollow. Adeline felt her stomach tighten. How can there be another channel? Micah climbed beneath the floor, carrying his lantern. For several minutes, only the scraping of wood echoed through the barn. When he finally crawled back out, his face was covered with damp clay. The original builders filled an old washout with loose rock. She blinked. They built the barn over it? They probably never knew. He brushed mud from his gloves. The underground water has been carrying soil away for years. So the foundation has been sinking long before either of us noticed. The danger had grown again. This was no longer simply a matter of surviving the coming frontier blizzard. If the ground failed beneath the eastern posts while heavy snow loaded the roof, the entire horse barn could collapse. Just before sunset, Elias Crow rode back into the yard. This time he wasn't laughing. "I've been checking my own place," he admitted. "Found 2 frozen drains and a cracked pump housing." Micah nodded. "The storm's teaching everyone." Elias hesitated before speaking again. "If you need another pair of hands." Adeline looked at Micah. Only days earlier the man had mocked him. Now he was asking how to help. Micah extended his hand without hesitation. "We start at sunrise." That night the temperature dropped faster than anyone expected. The water bucket beside the porch froze solid before midnight. The stars disappeared behind a pale white veil. Then, just after 1 o'clock in the morning, Ranger began barking again. Not toward the pasture, toward the northern ridge. Micah stepped outside. Far beyond the basin, the horizon had vanished. There was no line separating earth from sky anymore, only a towering wall of white moving silently across the prairie. He didn't need snowflakes to know what it was. The storm had arrived, and it was moving faster than any blizzard he had seen in 20 years. The first snow did not fall, it attacked. Just after dawn, the white wall Micah had seen on the northern horizon swallowed Black Willow Basin. Within minutes, the open prairie disappeared. Fence posts vanished one by one until only their top rails remained visible. The wind howled across the frontier ranch with such force that even speaking required shouting. Inside the frontier cabin, the windows rattled continuously. Fine snow forced itself through tiny cracks around the frames, gathering like flour along the floorboards. Micah tightened his coat. "It's time." Adeline already knew what he meant. The horse barn. If the eastern foundation failed now, 14 horses, 3 milk cows, and nearly every bale of winter hay would be lost before the storm reached its worst. A thick guide rope stretched from the cabin porch to the barn door, each knot exactly 10 feet apart. Micah had tied them days earlier. Now those knots became the only way to cross the 20-yard distance. "You stay here," Adeline ordered Owen. "I'm coming." "No." Micah knelt in front of the boy. "If anything happens to us, you're responsible for Millie." Owen wanted to argue. Instead, he nodded. For the first time since his father found work at Fenwick Ranch, Micah saw confidence replacing fear in his son's eyes. Outside, the wind struck like a solid object. Snow blasted sideways, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Micah wrapped one hand around the guide rope while Adeline followed close behind. Several times the gusts were so violent they had to stop and lean backward just to remain standing. When they finally reached the horse barn, a loud crack echoed above the storm. Both froze. Another crack. Not thunder, timber. Inside, frightened horses kicked wildly against their stalls. Dust drifted from the rafters every time the building shuddered. Micah climbed immediately into the hayloft. The eastern roof beam had begun twisting under uneven weight. Snow, driven by hours of relentless wind, had piled far deeper on one side than the other. "We have to lighten this side," he shouted. Together, they threw bale after bale toward the western loft. Every movement had to be fast but controlled. One wrong shift could collapse the roof before they finished. Then Ranger began barking. Not inside the barn, Outside, Micah looked through a narrow crack between the boards. One of the milk cows had broken through the drift fence. Terrified by the storm, she was dragging a section of broken rail toward the frozen creek. "If she reaches the ice," Adeline began, "we lose her." For one impossible moment they faced two disasters: save the barn or save the cow. Micah made the decision instantly. The barn saves everyone. Adeline stared at him. "It sounds cruel. It isn't. If this roof falls, every animal dies." She understood. Sometimes frontier survival demanded choosing the greater good instead of the nearest problem. They had almost finished redistributing the hay when the barn lurched beneath them. Not a vibration, a movement. The eastern floor dropped nearly 2 inches. Both lost their footing. Micah slammed one hand against a support post before he could fall through the loft opening. The foundation. He scrambled down the ladder. Water from the hidden underground seep had frozen solid beneath one corner of the barn. Expanding ice had lifted part of the foundation while another section settled into the muddy washout beneath it. Exactly as he had feared, the temporary drainage trench had bought them time. Not enough. "We need weight off this corner," Micah shouted. Without hesitation, Adeline opened the eastern stalls. The horses resisted only for a second before following Ranger toward the opposite end of the barn, away from the sinking foundation. The shift seemed almost insignificant. But 14 horses together weighed more than 7 tons. Slowly, painfully, the groaning timber stopped moving. Neither of them dared breathe. Then, for the first time in nearly an hour, silence. Not outside, the blizzard still roared, but inside the horse barn the beams held. Micah leaned against a post, exhausted. "We won this round." Before Adeline could answer, someone began pounding desperately on the barn door. 3 sharp blows. Then a familiar voice struggled through the wind. "Micah!" It was Elias Crow. And from the panic in his voice, Micah knew immediately. The storm had already claimed another ranch. Elias Crow burst through the horse barn door, nearly collapsing as the blizzard drove snow in behind him. "My barn is down," he shouted. "The cattle are scattered." Micah had barely caught his breath from saving Fenwick Ranch. The eastern foundation still groaned beneath the weight of snow, and every muscle in his body ached. Adeline grabbed his arm. "You can't go." Micah looked at Elias, then at the frightened horses now standing safely together inside the barn. "We still can." The 3 of them left immediately. A guide rope linked Micah, Adeline, and Elias together while 2 draft horses forced a path through chest-deep drifts. Ranger disappeared into the swirling snow, then reappeared again, barking whenever hidden fences or washouts lay ahead. Halfway to Elias's ranch, the wind erased every landmark. For several terrifying moments, they could no longer tell where the trail had been. Elias began turning west. Micah caught the rope. "No. We're lost. We're following the wrong thing." He pointed toward Ranger. "The dog isn't looking for the road. He's following the scent of the cattle." They trusted him. Minutes later, dark shapes emerged through the blowing snow. The herd, still alive. Elias's barn had already collapsed. Massive beams buried the feed room, while frightened cattle crowded against a stone wall, barely holding back the wind. One young calf remained trapped beneath a broken gate. Without thinking, Owen ran forward. "Stay back," Adeline shouted, but the boy had already dropped to his knees beside the calf. Using the short iron bar Micah always carried, he levered the broken timber upward just enough for Ranger to pull the frightened animal free. Micah watched silently. A week earlier, Owen would have hidden behind him. Now he acted before fear could stop him. As they gathered the surviving cattle, a deafening crack echoed across the ranch. Everyone looked up. The remaining half of Elias's barn was beginning to fall. "Move!" Micah yelled. The draft horses lunged forward, pulling the last cattle clear only seconds before the roof crashed into the snow with a thunderous roar. The impact sent a cloud of ice into the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Had they arrived 2 minutes later, every remaining animal would have been buried. The storm finally weakened near sunset. Gray clouds broke apart, revealing pale winter light across Black Willow Basin. When they returned to Fenwick Ranch, smoke still rose steadily from the frontier cabin. The horse barn stood. The hay remained dry. The water barrels were intact. Everything they had quietly prepared before the storm had endured. Inside the cabin, Millie disappeared into the pantry without saying a word. A moment later, she returned carrying the last bottle of fresh milk. She walked straight to Elias, whose hands were trembling from exhaustion, then held it out with both hands. "You should drink." Elias stared at the bottle. "This is yours," Millie smiled. "It was ours." No one in the room spoke. Adeline looked at Micah across the table. The day he had arrived, he had asked only one thing: "Give my kids milk. I'll fix your ranch." Now the child who had once guarded every crumb of food was freely giving away the last milk in the house. Without realizing it, the promise had come full circle. Over the following days, neighbors began arriving, not to admire the surviving ranch, but to learn from it. Micah showed them the drainage trench, the raised hay platform, the protected water barrels, and the guide rope stretched between buildings. Adeline never stood behind him. She walked beside him, explaining each improvement herself, handing other families charcoal and rough sketches Owen had drawn during the week. The ranch was no longer simply hers. Its knowledge belonged to everyone willing to prepare. As for Owen, he quietly nailed a small wooden sign beside the barn door before the first clear morning after the storm. It read, "Watch the land before the land teaches you." Micah read it once and smiled. He knew the boy no longer needed to memorize every lesson. He had begun living them. The frontier had not merely survived another winter. It had raised another generation ready to face the next one. Thank you for riding this frontier journey with us. If this story reminded you that preparation, kindness, and practical wisdom are worth passing on, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment stayed with you most? Was it Micah's promise, Owen rescuing the trapped calf, Millie offering the last bottle of milk, or Adeline choosing to teach others instead of keeping the knowledge for herself? Tell us in the comments below. If you enjoy authentic frontier survival stories filled with timeless homestead skills and real frontier wisdom, please subscribe and join our growing community. And if you believe these lessons deserve to live on, share this video with someone who loves the history, resilience, and spirit of the American frontier. Until our next story, stay prepared, stay humble, and always remember, nature speaks first to those willing to listen.